As part of our discussion today, we will speak about memory and observation for a security guard, a very important facet relating to security patrols, to the issue of surveillance, to the issue of situational awareness. I want you to be familiar with some basic principles of observation and memory, and in essence, some details about the workings of the human mind. A human being, all human beings, are bombarded daily with information from so many different sources, most of which is absorbed through the human eye. In fact, physiologists tell us that about 90% of the information that we acquire about the world around us, we acquire as human beings through the sense of sight. So for an ordinary sighted person, being able to see things is one of the most important ways through which we learn about the world around us. But if you stop and think about it, there are so many hundreds, if not thousands, of things happening around us almost at any given moment in time, that if we were to focus, if we were to remember, to take detailed note of all those things happening around us, we would probably drive ourselves crazy because there's just such an abundance of information. So the human mind has an incredible capacity to filter out information that it deems to be unnecessary for its task, for its purpose, for that given point in time. And we can refer to that ability to filter, in essence, as vigilance. Vigilance is the mind's capacity to cope with information, and there are things that affect our levels of vigilance as human beings, both positively, making us more vigilant, and negatively, making us less vigilant. And particularly, we know that monotony, that is the sameness of things, when there is very little deviation or very little change in our environment, causes us to lose our ability to focus or our ability to remain vigilant, while novelty, things that are quick, things that are happening around us, things that are different from moment to moment, generally tend to increase our capacity to remain vigilant. In other words, we are paying more attention to things that interest us and stimulate us, and less attention to those things that kind of are mundane and bore us, and things that don't seem to have a relative interest to us at that point in time. So vigilance, our ability to focus, is one of the ways the human mind copes with the vast volumes of information that we see, that we absorb, that's going on around us constantly. If you stop and think about all of the individual details that one would encounter, would experience, would observe, just walking to the corner grocery store on any given day, there is just so much that really the human mind is aware, but filters out. As a security guard, particularly in maintaining observations, vigilance in relation to your sight, issues surrounding surveillance and situational awareness, the key is to be aware of subtle things that happen around us, and those subtle things generally denote occurrences that may be relevant or important to us doing our jobs appropriately and effectively. And in understanding this issue of how memory functions, how observation works, how we as security personnel can remain active and vigilant and aware of our environment, I want you to remember a basic principle that guides our understanding of memory and observation, and that principle is as follows. As human beings, we look at things through our eyes. The world around us is visual, and looking at something is an event, is an action. Looking is an action that we perform constantly and continuously through our waking hours. While we look at things with our eyes, we see things with our minds. In other words, the difference between merely looking at something and actually absorbing it, observing it, being aware of that which we have seen, is whether we've paid attention to that thing or not. So there are a lot of things happening around us every day and all the time, but we have no real need to pay attention to those various things occurring. Hence the mind filters out these non-relevant events around us. But when we focus on something, when we pay attention to that thing, in other words, we see it with our minds rather than merely looking at it with our eyes, we commit that event, that observation, that situation to memory. So the issue, the idea of remembering something or being aware of something, first and foremost, hinges on whether we merely looked at something, or that's the process of looking at it with our eyes, or whether we saw it with our minds. You can't expect to remember something that you didn't pay attention to. So for a security guard, the issue is, how do we begin to pay better, closer attention to the environment around us, to the area that we're protecting, to the people with whom we're interacting day to day? How do we become better observers? How do we pay better or closer attention to important events? Surveillance. The word surveillance is derived from the French verb surveiller, which translates to watch over. And for a security guard, there are many different approaches or applications to surveillance, to watching over. There is physical surveillance, the act of observing an environment, conditions, people who might attend on the premises. Active surveillance can be overt. Making yourself evident and obvious, can be covert from a more discreet or secretive position. Surveillance can be electronic as well as physical. We can monitor the premises, the perimeter of the premises through observational posts, cameras that might be set up in order to provide static surveillance. So the very fact is that surveillance is an important method for an active security guard to acquire, to obtain information about the premises that he or she protects, to remain engaged and aware of what's happening around the facility. It is an important way to safeguard, to protect a premises and a facility. Since surveillance entails watching over, observational skills are key to that process. It's essential that a security guard conducting any form of surveillance or surveillance in any way remains constantly vigilant and constantly alert to everything happening around him or her, whether it is through electronic means, monitoring a bank of security monitors, or physical patrols that are designed and intended in part to help a security guard observe an area, premises, and denote things like changes from one patrol to another, from one day to another, from 1 hour to another. Changes can be subtle, things that are moved out of or brought into a facility or premises. Changes can be dramatic. We can conduct a patrol and see obvious and evident things that attract our attention immediately and cause us to be concerned or to activate a response, an appropriate response in relation to events that we see. So surveillance, observational skills are all areas that security guards need to develop and maintain in the sharpest focus possible. Of course, the issue of observation is connected to the issue of memory. We need to be able to remember what we saw, and the human brain, the human mind, is an incredibly complex machine, really more sophisticated than the most sophisticated computer systems that we have, which is saying quite a bit in this age of mega computer capacity, artificial intelligence. The fact is that that computers can do so much today that we couldn't even dream of years ago, and still the human mind far surpasses the ability of even the most advanced computers. And the one thing that I want people to remember is that the human brain works like any other muscle in the body. Like a muscle, the harder you use it, the sharper and stronger it can become. Memory, when we think about recalling or remembering an event, for most people operates sort of on a passive level, in the sense that we don't really think about remembering things. It just happens that at the end of the day you remember events, at the end of the week, at the end of the month or the year, or at different stages of your life. You remember things that happened in the past. I want to spend just a minute or two talking about the function of memory, and hopefully have you better appreciate or understand this enormous ability that all of us have to remember events and situations and circumstances, especially those that are important to us. And let me start with a question or an example. There are people who are able to remember vast amounts of information. It seems that it's almost effortless to them, and there are people who complain that they have a poor memory or bad memory. So let's address that second group for a moment. If anybody watching or listening thinks that maybe they have a bad memory, I want you to try the following exercise. And you can pause the video to take as much time as you want in order to complete this effectively. If you think that you have a bad memory, I want you to think of something that you know, maybe a friend's telephone number or an address, or your teacher's name from high school, or any piece of information from your past. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to take as long as you need and try as hard as you can to forget that piece of information. If you want, you can pause the tape now. And whether you have paused or not, the point is simply this, that it is impossible to forget something that you already know. So the issue of memory, of developing your memory, actually has less to do with the process of memory and more to do with understanding how memory functions. And what I'm trying to say is that for most people who might forget bits of information, it's probably far more accurate to say that you didn't forget that information, you probably didn't pay close enough attention to it in the first place to have it make any sort of an impact or an imprint on your memory. So let's start by understanding a basic reality or principle of how memory works. So there are people who remember, as I started to say, vast tracts of information. They can do so for very long periods of time, and others who forget details, and you probably fit into both camps at different times in the week or different times in your life. Memory can really be divided into short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory are those things, those events, those experiences that we have that we forget about almost as soon as we go through that particular experience, whereas long-term memory has to do with events that stay with us for a very, very long period of time. Since for most people, the process of remembering is a passive thing, they really don't pay attention to it. They really don't think about what it is that happens as they experience an event or as they try to recall something. Let's speak a little bit about the distinctions, the difference between long-term memory and short-term memory. Have you ever had an experience where you've done something, you've gone somewhere, you've spoken to somebody, and you forget about that event, that conversation almost as soon as it's happened, and other occasions where you experience something and without even thinking about it, that memory, that event, that experience or details of the experience stay with you long after the event itself is over. What is it that distinguishes between long and short-term memory? Is it that some events are more important to the individual and that becomes a matter of long-term memory? Is it some events are of little or less interest and that's committed to short-term memory? Do we actually have any control over long and short-term memory? Let me give you a practical example that you might be able to relate to, especially if you spend any time with elderly people, parents, grandparents, neighbors, people that you might know. Have you ever spoken to an older person who regales you with stories about their history? They tell you stories about when they were a child and where they played and who their friends were, and they describe their favorite toys or their pets or whatever. They can tell you about things that happened 70 and 80 and sometimes more years ago with perfect and vivid clarity. And yet, if you ask them what they had for breakfast this morning, or when is their next medical appointment, or whether they took their medications today, they're unable to remember. How is it that certain events in their history are remembered without any effort whatsoever, and in fact remembered in vivid clarity, and other events that seem more pertinent to them, I mean breakfast and medications and medical appointments and so on, seem to be far more imperative for a person's health and well-being, those are things that people cannot remember. What is it that distinguishes between long-term and short-term memory? Is it that they've repeated the story often enough, and that's why they remember the events when they were a child? Well, they had no real reason to repeat those stories, certainly not throughout the majority of their lives. What is it that distinguishes between short and long-term memory? And let me give you a different example that you might be able to relate to. Everybody crosses the street every day to get from one side to another, regardless of where you might be going. If your cell phone rings while you are halfway across the street, you're not going to stop, and I hope you're not going to stop and answer the phone, because it would be dangerous for you to stop in the middle of the road in order to take a call. But if you were to do something silly like that, and you saw a bus traveling towards you, you'd know enough to clear the intersection, to clear the path in enough time to avoid being struck by that bus. The individual who stays in the middle of the road to take a call is risking his own life, whereas somebody who gets to the other side for safety is doing the prudent thing, what would be expected of a reasonable person. If somebody says to you, "Hey, did you see that bus that just passed by?" You'd probably say, "No, I didn't even pay attention to it. No way." Right? You have no practical recollection of the bus, even though had you stayed in your original spot, surely it would have ended your life. So why is it that you have no real recollection of a bus or a truck or a vehicle bearing down towards you once you're on the other side of the street? That's the first scenario. Just hold on to that question. So in this one case, the bus is barreling towards you. You get across the street for safety, and you have no real memory of that bus at all. But imagine standing on one side of the street, looking over, and you see a bus, God forbid, careening out of control. It skids and sideswipes vehicles and crushes people and flips over, and you hear screams of victims, and you see all sorts of the most horrific events taking place. If somebody were to say to you, did you see that bus? The answer, of course, would be absolutely. Do you remember details of the buses you saw? And the answer, once again, would be of course. Not only do you remember the details, but you'd probably be able to, not even be able to, you'd probably relive that experience, that traumatic experience that you've gone through, because it is very traumatic to see that kind of an event, repeatedly throughout the rest of your life. In fact, it's something that you'll never forget. And there are people who experience horrific events in their lives, and they end up going to therapy for years just trying to come to terms, just trying to control or to reduce the anxiety that those events, the memory of those events causes. So what is it that differentiates between the bus in the first scenario and the bus in the second scenario that I've just spoken about? Why is it that the first case, the short-term memory example, sort of escapes your mind shortly after the event, the occurrence, whereas the long-term memory example will likely stay with you for a very long time? And we understand the following, that whether it's the bus crashing out of control or whether it's the grandparent regaling you with stories of their youth, any event, any experience that was associated with some type of emotion tends to be seared into our memory much more completely than an event that's really devoid of any emotional connotation. So you are better able to you're better able to remember experiences that were accompanied by some emotion, and more particularly a strong emotion. A strong emotion can be happiness, such as the grandparent who 80 years ago was playing with his or with her friends or their toys or their pets. They remember with detail those things that made them happy in their youth. The military veteran who returns and struggles with PTSD because of the experiences, the horrific experiences that repeat themselves in his or her mind continuously throughout their lives. Anything that's associated with a strong emotion, happiness, anger, fear, joy, embarrassment, are all examples of things that, if someone experiences an event associated with that emotion, will likely be seared into long-term memory, things that are easy to remember. So the fact is that when you are conducting security patrols, we hope, we anticipate, we hope that you will not be confronted with dramatic events that cause you either to be fearful or concerned or embarrassed or even joyous for that matter. We'd rather separate security patrols from any sort of emotion whatsoever. So how is it that a security guard, an active security guard, can develop his or her memory? How can we develop an ability to retain and recall events during security patrols? So one of the things that I want you to understand has to do with the way that we generally observe events. And a principle that guides this idea of human observation or attention is actually better expressed through reference not to attention on its own, but rather to a principle called selective attention. Selective attention is the means through which most of us find things that we might be looking for day to day, and it works in this way. If I were to say to you, find an anomaly, find something that doesn't look right in the scene around us, around me, around you. And I left it at that. I just simply asked you to pay attention to your environment and find something that doesn't belong. Well, you can guess at a few things. You might see some things that don't quite sit well with you, but did you really focus on anything that was out of the ordinary? Were you able to pay attention to anything significant? Conversely, if I said to you, look for signs of a break-in, look for signs of forced entry, look for a person who doesn't belong, look for a car parked in an inappropriate spot, for example, in a fire route, I'm now giving you something to focus on, and the very fact that I'm giving you something that's identifiable to you means that you have a better chance of seeing that thing, particularly if I'm pointing it out to you or activating your selective attention. Let me give you a better example of selective attention at work in your own lives and in your own days. Imagine a situation like this. Most people have experienced this before. You learn a new word. You heard somebody using a word, you read it, you didn't know the definition of that word, and you had to look it up. Whether you looked it up online or whether you asked a friend, what does this mean? Suddenly you have the definition of that word, you learn something new. Did you ever notice that as soon as you learn a new word, it starts popping up all over the place? If you listen to the evening news, a newscaster uses that word, you might read it in a headline, you might hear people having a regular conversation, and suddenly you hear that word popping up again and again and again. So the question is, how did that word suddenly gain some such prominence and popularity? How is it that people suddenly started to use that word that you just became aware of and learned? And the answer is that the word is no more popular after you learned it than it was before. The only difference is now that you've defined the word, you became aware of it. And the very fact that you are aware of it causes you to pay closer or better attention to that word, and that's why it seems to pop up all over the place. That's one example of selective attention, the way the human mind observes and absorbs information of things happening around it and around you. Let me give you another example of selective attention at work. For anybody who's had the experience of buying a new car, not everybody drives a car or buys a new car, but for those people who have, there's a process involved in going out to buy a car. You kind of do a bit of research, maybe online, and you think about the cars that you like. You start looking at various types of models or brands. You go into a Chrysler dealership or a General Motors dealership or Ford or whichever dealership, and you kind of look around and you start sensing the kind of vehicle that you'd like to drive. Now that you've narrowed it down, you start focusing on that particular brand, whether it's a GM or whatever. You start going to General Motors dealerships, and something happens towards the end of your search when you walk into that final dealership. And you walk out onto the sales floor and it hits you. There it is. That car that's sitting on the showroom floor is beautiful. It's amazing. It's incredible. You might have seen many others of that same particular car, but never in that color, never in that particular trim, never in that particular position or whatever the issue is, and you've settled on the car that you want to buy. Now, for most people, buying a car is sort of an emotional process. Many people buy a car that they love, not necessarily a car that's just practical or makes sense to drive. Because of that passion, people get excited about a new vehicle, and you finalize the purchase. And it takes a day or two for the dealership to finalize the licensing and to prepare the car for delivery. You come in and pick up the car, and one of the things that's always sort of sat in your mind is how unique this particular vehicle is. Maybe it's that shade of color, or the options that it has, or the wheels, or whatever it is. You've seen a lot of General Motor vehicles or a lot of cars like that, but never in that specific combination of trim and colors. You get the keys, you're excited, you drive off the lot, you drive down the street, maybe a half a block or more, you get to the first stoplight, and you turn, which turns red, and you sit in the middle, or you sit in the intersection waiting for the light to turn green. And what is it that you see immediately across the street, or driving through your field of vision, if not the exact same car in the exact same color in the exact same trim? And as you continue to drive home or wherever you're going, you start seeing that same vehicle pop up almost everywhere that you go. So the question is, how is it that that vehicle suddenly became so much more popular since the last half hour that you picked up the vehicle? Was there a sudden influx of that particular car or style off of the rails or the ships or wherever it came in from? And the answer is not at all. The only difference between what happened before and what's happening now is that mentally you're far more aware of that car, that color, those features, that trim than you were before. And it's the mind's ability to focus on what it's searching for that helps you recognize those things that are that become much more easily observed to you. That is selective attention at work. It's the mind's ability to identify things based on having established a criteria as to what it is that the mind is looking for. You're much more likely to find something that's clearly defined in your mind than you are just looking for things in general. So if we apply this to a security guard's routine, for example, the routine of a patrol, if we were to say to you, go out and patrol and look for any anomalies, look for anything that doesn't make sense, look for anything out of the ordinary, well, hopefully you'll find broad and dramatic things that are out of the ordinary, a broken glass, a discarded tool, or people that don't belong. But are you able to detect, are you able to discern subtle things that might give hint of potential future problems? That's the issue of observational skills, the ability of a security guard to identify not those things that are clear and obvious, but those things that are subtle. So the first thing that I want you to understand is that in order to understand things that are out of the ordinary, you need to be very familiar with things that are ordinary for a security guard. Each time you go out to conduct a patrol, each time that you visit a particular section of the facility or a particular department or speak to particular people, pay close attention to those things that are regular and routine so that you can develop a map, so to speak, in your mind of what the ordinary is. And the better you can discern and detect the ordinary, the better you will be able to identify the unordinary, the extraordinary, the distinctions or differences in the environment that you are protecting. So the first issue surrounding memory and observation is to be aware that we see things all around us all the time, and the mind tends to filter out the regular, the ordinary, the things that are uneventful. But when we identify, when we know what it is that we're looking for, distinctions or differences from the ordinary, then when we see something that contains those differences, it's much more likely that we'll be far more instantly alert and aware of what it is that's going on, what it is that we see around us, what it is that we should be paying attention to. So the issue of memory and observation is something that is a foundation for a professional or an effective security guard. Security guards should develop an ability to remain sharp and to remain focused and to continue practicing observational skills in many different ways and many different circumstances or situations. Mental acuity puzzles or problems that you might read and analyze are an excellent way to develop the mind and to develop your ability to retain information, to recall information. Reading details about the world around you is an excellent way to develop the mind and to retain information. Writing things outside of those things that you need to write for work, journaling, is an excellent way of being able to focus on your observations, to focus on those things that are happening around you, and develop an ability to document, to write down things that while they may be initially only of interest to you, develop your capacity to observe, to retain, and to document for the benefit of other people, which is really what you would be doing in a security report, an incident report, even your notebooks. Mental puzzles and mental acuity exercises that you might find online, you might find in various observational development or memory development books and materials, are all excellent ways for a security guard, and in fact for every human being, to develop a capacity or an ability to improve and to develop and refine and sharpen and focus our memory and observational skills.